Good morning. We'll be starting up here in about another minute, minute and a half, whatever my clock says. It's time. Okay. So good morning and welcome to the last of our summer series of our foundational webinars. My name is David Orr. I'm the director here with the Corner Liquor Roads program. We're your New York State LTAP Center. And today we're talking about snow and ice. It's an overview. Tell you more about some other things we're doing here over the course of the morning. So we'll be starting up here and get ready to go. We will be doing some polls, and most of you have probably done this before, but it's pollev.com/DavidOrPE that we'll be using, and I'll give you a little more details on that as we get into it. If you haven't been on one of the webinars, remember audio settings are down in the lower left. Please open up your chat pod. The main reason there is that way we can send you messages, a link to the handouts and a link to the poll site so you don't have to type it all in. And so if you open up your chat pod, you'll start seeing those messages. If you want to contact us, open up your Q&A pod. That's how you can put questions in or interact with us if you can't get to the polls. And I may even ask you to do something in the Q&A. So please open that up, and I may even ask you to raise your hand. So those are all at the bottom of the screen. This particular webinar is worth one professional development hour here in New York State. But remember, it's only the person who is registered, unless you had contacted us ahead of time, which we haven't heard from anybody. So it's just the person who registered today. Good news is it's counted as a course here in New York State. Remember, there's courses and educational activities, and at least half of what you do has to be in the course category. If you're from another state, and we'll find out if you are here in a minute, you'll need to contact the LTAP Center in your particular state to find out if this session is good enough. It is a general session on snow and ice, though it does have some New York State specific items in it. So let's start with a little bit of a welcome. Let's see who's here, what your titles are. You guys have probably all done this before, but it helps me to see who's in the room. I have a guess on who it is, but let's just see how that is. So this is with the pollev.com. And again, if you can't access that, you can put your answer in the Q&A. So first, who do you work for? Town, county, city or village, state or federal, tribal, consultants, contractor, or you're working for the weekend? There's at least a couple of people who are honest and are working for the weekend here today. Okay. Wow, we've got a variety. I don't think I've seen as good a variety. That's pretty good. I like it because we've got town, we've got county. We have a crew leader who's putting in the Q&A. That's good. Nice to know. Okay. What is your job for your agency? Are you an administrator? Are you the highway superintendent? Are you DPW commissioner, an engineer, field crew? Things like that. It's going to have, like, I guess, a lot of engineers. It doesn't surprise me. If you put none of the above, and nobody has, put it in the Q&A, or you can just type it in the Q&A if you're not sure. And then finally, where are you from? You can click on the map, where you're from here in New York State, and we'll just get a sense of, are we talking mostly people in the urban areas, rural areas, downstate, upstate? Oh, that's pretty good. Nobody from Buffalo. Surprised. Nobody from the Buffalo area. Maybe they're still celebrating their come from behind win there over the weekend. And we have somebody from New Jersey. Okay. Good to know. Okay. So again, we're going to be doing a snow and ice overview today. We have a full workshop on snow and ice. I'll show you the locations on dates on that at the end of our hour together. We're just touching on the basics, hopefully whet your appetite and hopefully make you interested to come see the workshop that's going to be held this fall. We're going to talk a little bit about weather, especially in New York, but even for the person from New Jersey, there will be some information that might be helpful there. We're going to talk about the level of service. What level of service do you maintain on your roads and streets? The materials that we use to maintain snow and ice, and of course, the equipment that goes with it. We'll discuss just a touch a little bit on routes and emergencies, which is all part of the policy that we're going to have. So this is what our goals are today, and hopefully you'll pick up one or two things you can take home and put into your plans for this coming winter. Now, with one word, this is called a wordle. you haven't done Wordles before, they're pretty fun. Why is snow and ice critical? But remember, do it as one word, and it will create, and we'll see what people think. What, why is snow and ice critical on our roads and streets? Safety. Very good. Safety. I see another safety. Okay. Got to worry about things that are dangerous. Somebody over on the left has put traction over in the Q&A. That's good. Accessibility. Okay. Money. Yeah, money. Money actually is part, it has to be part of the equation. We always have to think about the money. Accessibility, I see. Issues, unforeseen, travel. Okay. So yeah, a very good list, but most of the time we don't think about it, but let's look at the three things I've got on my list that I think are important. Obviously, safety is the number one. Okay, I'll put it in the lower left corner just because the pictures fit that way, but safety is number one. Number two is actually travel. You know, if the road's covered in snow and ice, it's really hard to get from point A to point B, and we need to keep going 365.25 days a year, if you count leap years. So that's important. But at the same time, we want to make sure we're doing this in such a way that we don't create environmental damage. And we can actually do that if we're smart about it. But that means we have to think carefully about our overall plans and our overall policies. Okay? Now, most of you deal with snow and ice, it looked like, but if not, you deal with it just driving from point A to point B. So what kinds of winter weather do we have to handle? What kind of winter weather? Safety weather. Huh? Didn't know there was safety weather. That's pretty cool. Okay, what kind of winter weather? Cold. Yeah, just cold weather can make a big difference. Obviously, sleet. Ooh, sleet's fun, especially if it melts and gets on the road. Freezing rain. Nobody likes freezing rain. Um, Snow, of course. We get lots of snow here in New York. Sleet. Okay. Wet weather, especially if it turns cold, it becomes black ice. That's a real challenge. Ice. Yeah. Freezing and thawing can damage the roadways. We have to account for that. That's on a pavement class side, but still, that's important. A smooth road's easier to maintain. Okay. So again, we got all kinds of winter weather, and we need to have that in our plans and how we're going to adjust if it's a blizzard versus if it's just a snowstorm, if it's lake effect, really makes a big difference on what we might have to do. And of course, yeah, this morning we did have some fog. I can see it burning off in the valley down in Ithaca. So yeah, these are all things to think about. So when we look at the weather here in New York State, this is a map showing snowfall amounts. Now, it is actually about now close to 20 years old. I need to update it. We know the numbers are changing a little bit. We're seeing a little bit less snow in New York State than we used to. The points where we get the most snow are still the same. Where just our totals are going down slightly. But if you measure, this is the snow amounts on average in inches. Okay. And we know the numbers again, they're slightly down, but there's still an awful lot of snow at the end of the lakes. Okay. You get a lot of snow off Lake Ontario because it never freezes. You'll get snow off of Lake Erie. Lately, the snow off Lake Erie actually has gone longer than it used to. So in some respects, that area is actually getting more snow longer in the winter because you don't get the lake freezing because Lake Erie actually will freeze in a cold winter. And you can actually see the effects of the Catskills and the Finger Lakes because they get a little more snow in those areas because of the water that's available. Now, obviously the lakes provide water source for snow and ice and things like that, but we get all kind of lovely winter weather patterns. This is the one we think about. Storms coming from west to east, from California to New York, bringing with them the weather that comes across the country. And that's, of course, the same kind of pattern that leads to tornadoes. I'm listening to a podcast about Tornado Alley that's shifting or growing or doing something coming east, which is partly responsible for why we're seeing more big storms here in New York. But we'll talk about that in emergency session next year. We can also get a polar vortex or really cold air coming down in from Canada. And when that comes across the lakes, that's why we get the lake effect machine going. And we get lots and lots of snow from that. So that's a big issue that we get. If we want a lot of moisture, we can get water coming up from the Gulf of Mexico. The good news is, we think sometimes that, well, that also usually brings warmth, so it typically isn't as cold. However, if it hits at the wrong time of year and you get cold air coming from above, you can get large volumes of snow or worse, freezing rain or ice. And so those storms can actually be some of the worst in terms of dealing with them. And of course, there's the infamous nor'easter, A storm that either starts in the Gulf or starts in the southeast comes up the coast, acts almost like a hurricane, and swings back around, hence northeast. It comes in, the winds do actually from that direction. And that's actually usually where we get some of our deepest, heaviest snows. So these are all winter weather patterns that we have to deal with, ranging from the Alberta Clipper all the way down to weather coming up from underneath. And that changes our plan. So we have to be accounting for and ready for all of those different patterns. So this leads to something called the level of service. Now, the level of service means that we're not going to treat every single road exactly the same. We're not going to have perfectly bare roads all the time. And that's a challenge. It's a communication issue with the public. And they don't always want to hear that. They want every road to be perfectly smooth and go whatever speed they think they can go. But obviously, there's a balance between safety and cost and getting from point A to point B. Now, one way to sort of start putting your brain wrapped around level of service is think about the stopping distance. If you're on a dry pavement and you put down the brakes and you stop, this is the distance, by the way, to stop the vehicle, not the distance to respond. Hopefully you slow down when the weather's bad, but this is the distance your vehicle actually takes to stop. So if you think about dry conditions, you put the brakes on and you can stop at some distance. Oh, it might be a few hundred feet at a high speed. It'd be a lot less at low speed, but we'll call that distance ratio 1. If it's a wet condition, it's going to go up by quite a bit, about 70% if it's pretty wet. We actually design most road conditions, most road designs and highway designs and curves and things like that around that wet condition because that's one that's common enough that we design to that, and actually our signs are designed to that as well. But now we get into winter weather. If we get slushy snow, but we can still grip the pavement, it's close to wet, not too bad. Same with fresh sand on packed snow, especially on an unpaved roadway. You need about twice as much as dry and about, an additional 15–20% more than wet. So not too bad. You can still get around as long as you're careful and you stay in your travel lane. But you start getting loose snow or you get just sand on some snow with light traffic, it can start to get little bits of ice into it. And those little bits of ice make it even more difficult to stop. And you can have to be 3.5 times as much as if it were dry conditions. And even 4 if you get snowpack that's got little bits of ice in it. And that's more than twice the distance of the wet conditions. And of course, with ice, the books all say 5 to 6. I usually say 6 plus because if you get ice, especially if it's a black ice consideration or it's a freezing rain, you're stopping when you hit something. Hopefully it's a slope in a ditch and you can be pulled back out, which I've done, or something light that just does at most property damage. But, we don't like ice at all. So every agency should have pavement condition goals, and they won't be the same for every single roadway. This is what the public wants, right? They want it to be absolutely dry. They don't want anything that's going to slow them down. They'll be okay with this, but even this makes them nervous because there's little bits of ice off to the side. And of course, once you get some packed snow on there, if this is a residential area, so probably not too bad, but if this was an arterial or collector or a major road, now you've got some concerns. And we're probably too late to just come in and do anti-icing. We're going to have to treat this and do a lot of work to get it fixed. And of course, this is to the point where it might be okay in a residential area, but it's probably unsafe for people to go with any high speed. So they're going to really have to slow down. So maybe we need to do better than this. And finally, of course, during the storm event, it may be even hard to see the roadway. So delineation and signs can really help us with safety. And of course, that's assuming the public is behaving in a reasonable way, because you and I both know that sometimes they'll go out in the middle of the storm. And this particular series of pictures, I don't have one that hides the houses, but you've all been in storm events where you can't even see the houses a few hundred feet away because the wind is blowing, and yet people still insist on driving. But we do need to set a level of service, and that's a communications issue between you as the highway people, the public, and the board. The board needs to be part of setting a level of service for a variety of reasons. But let me ask, does your agency have a level of service? Do you have a level you can go, yep, we have a level of service? And the answers, of course, are yes in writing, yes in my head, you need to develop one, you don't have one, or none of the above. Now, if you put in none of the above, please put in the Q&A what that means. What does that mean if you put in none of the above? Okay. So put in the Q&A if you don't have a level of service. Okay, so we have a couple of people who did that but don't have an answer. So if you need to develop one or you don't, you definitely want to be thinking about coming to one of our workshops this fall, or at minimum getting the workbooks. But you'll learn a lot more. You can talk to some other agencies. And in the handout that was in the chat pod, you actually can get a link to some ones that we have on our website. So we do actually have some we've gotten from other agencies, some towns, villages, and a county. If you can't access the handout, as you see in the chat, just email us and Amanda will send it right back out to you. Okay, so you need to have a level of service. It's a communication tool. It's a liability tool. It reduces all of the risks down to a reasonable level. You can't get rid of it completely, but you do want to have one that you can go back to and defend if something happens. Okay, and then of course there's the question of written notice and all that, but that's a legal webinar. We don't have time to get into too much today. So how do you go about setting a level of service? Well, again, uh, it's something to be thinking about. So how do you set a level of service? For those of you who are on the consultant side, it's actually the same process you would use in developing a local road safety plan. It's the same process you would use in setting up an asset management plan. You need to figure out what are your priorities, where are you going to go first, what roads are you going to keep open if you get a major event, and then what roads are you going to go to next. A good way to start, especially in an urban area, would be to go online, go to the New York State DOT has a federal aid map that you can go, so they call it the Federal Aid Viewer, and you can actually see which roads are arterials, which roads are collectors, which roads are local, and that'd be a good starting point. I will not say that's a finishing point, but it's a good starting point. And then you can sit down with the board and start prioritizing which roads are going to be kept open first, especially during a storm event, and then which roads are going to get plowed secondary, and then finally the last roads to get plowed. I live on one of the last roads to get plowed in the city of Ithaca because, well, it's a residential street and most of the people there can either delay things or they walk to work like I do. So it, by sense, has to be towards the end. Somebody has to be on the last road, but again, this is the communication with the public. So let me ask you, what would you put in as which affects the roads and streets having a higher level of service? How would you do that? What's going to be the things that changes that? And I'm first going to let you put in some answers, and then we'll see what y'all came up with. It's pretty fun. You're putting your answers in, and then I'm going to click on responses in just a second. So I give you about 30 seconds. Put in what affects which roads or streets have a higher level of service. What would you put down? And again, if you're not doing a snow and ice plan, then you could put down the same things you would do for a safety plan with, of course, some snow and ice stuff added in, and you probably come pretty close. Okay, so I'll give you 30 seconds. And again, if you can't, you can throw it over in the Q&A. Okay, let's see what y'all came up with. There you go. Okay, so now you can start developing a plan for this. You have all the information you need. What roads are needed for emergency access? Where's the highest levels of traffic and volume? Okay, what are the main roads for commercial activities? How about getting to the hospital? I see that's a pretty high thing in there. Commercial traffic, topography, and terrain make a difference. Okay, where are your fire stations? Where are your schools? These are all things that we can put in looking at high quality. And now, of course, a lot of us deal with other agencies. There might be a town and a county. There might be a city and a village, a city or a village, although there are some cities and villages next to each other. And you may need to coordinate how you're doing these activities. And of course, a lot of us do work for other agencies, and we need to know what their plans are as well. But you've got everything you need here. You really have a pretty good sense, and you should do that. Sit down, make a list of the high priorities, and then go and set the level of service. And here's a pretty cool trick. Take your map, okay? So we'll go back and we'll look at our map. Take that map that you've got. You've all got a map of your roads in your system. Make a list of what are the high priority things you want to think about. Maybe even put them on the map if they're schools or fire stations or your own highway garage. Then take a series of markers. 6 is usually the most. 5 is probably enough, but take a series of markers. Sit down with somebody from the board, a champion, somebody you can work with, and together come up with a 20% that are high priority, 20% that are the next highest, and so on until you have the last 20%, the lowest priority. Now, it won't be exact because of the nature of the way roads work, but now everybody's on the same page. We're going to do these roads have the highest level of service. We're going to serve them first. Maybe these roads, we're going to let them get a little bit lower. We're going to get to them last. And then you have to communicate that back out to the public. But now you have a plan that everybody has put in together and everybody wins. So it's a pretty cool way to set the level of service. And yes, you can use this for asset management, local road safety plans, anything where you need to get communication. It's a good way to get an agreement between you and the board, the people who are setting the financial side of the house. Okay? So now, before we can set the level of service, we do need to talk a little bit about what you're using for your materials. How do we treat snow and ice? Okay? Now, again, this is an hour in the workshop, so we're just going to briefly touch on some of the more critical issues when it comes to snow and ice. The first thing is abrasives, sand. Okay? So I told you I might have you raise your hand. Go over and raise your hand. You pull down to the bottom. Raise your hand if you have abrasives in your system. If you use abrasives, okay? Let's see how many of you. A lot of you have mentioned your consultants, so you may or may not have sand. But if you ask yourself this on your own driveway, at your own house or apartment, do you use sand? Okay. Raise your hand if you do. Okay. Let's see how many of you. So not pretty small percentage of you. Okay. Most of us are going to use some sand at some point. When you get really, really cold weather, when you get ice, you may need sand. Sand gives you temporary improvement, but it doesn't melt the snow at all. It doesn't break any kind of bonds. So we do need probably some sand in the mix, but having sand as a first priority, if done improperly, can lead to actually pollution issues. But if you've got an unpaved road, you're going to need sand. And sometimes in a rural area, you may need some sand because of the routes you've got. If the route has an unpaved road on it, you just can't put straight salt down. So you want to think about that. But remember, if you're putting down abrasives, you only need enough salt in it to do the job of keeping it from sticking together. The abrasives are doing most of the work. If you're doing a 50-50 blend of sand and salt, you might as well go straight salt because you're putting down the same amount of salt as if you were putting down straight salt. And then you don't have to deal with the fact that those sand is left over and builds up on your shoulders. So sand needs to be part of the equation, but think about when and where you would be using it. Now, in terms of salts, this is the stuff that we use the most are salts, sodium chloride, i.e. rock salt, magnesium chloride, and calcium chloride. And what I'm showing you here is something called a eutectic curve. Essentially what it says is, as you add more of these salts, the mixture of the water that's melted because the snow melts and the snow and ice that are there, they all sort of creep over towards the right. The temperature goes down. You can actually get the mixture below freezing. This is how we make ice cream with a churn. So we take ice that's at freezing, we add some salt to it, we add enough, and we actually get the entire mixture below freezing, even on a hot day. It's a pretty cool trick of chemistry. And that's really what we're doing when we put them on the road. And they track a little different, but truth be told, they track pretty closely to each other. So as you add the salts, whether it's a magnesium or calcium chloride, they can take care of the ice. Certainly calcium chloride can take care of ice and start to melt it at much colder temperatures. But as it gets diluted by more snow, more rain, more melting snow and ice, they're all going to track towards each other. So you have to keep reapplying them or come up with ways to not have the snow and ice form, and you can plow it off with your snowplow. So keep that in mind. all these actually do very similar things. And a lot of these additives that we add, like we add calcium or magnesium, they're coating just rock salt. The rock salt is still the dominant player in a lot of cases. So think about your chemical processes and what you're going to use. And realize this, as they get diluted, as you get more snow, as you get more traffic, you can lose the value of the salts. And of course, too much salt doesn't do anybody any good. Now, there are other chemicals out there. There are things that we use at airports like urea and potassium acetate because they don't damage plane bodies too much. There's something called calcium magnesium acetate, which was developed to replace the salts and the other things that have some negatives, but it has its own negatives. It has its place, and of course, it's relatively expensive. Most of the time when I've seen it, or we've seen it as we've gone around, it's used in limited places or in an urban area where it's a little bit better for people who are walking on it, but it's not perfect. There is no such thing as a perfect chemical out there. Now, there are these what are called carbohydrate enhanced chemicals. They're the leftover waste product from making something else. Beer, wine, cheese, anything that has a liquid process has some leftover carbohydrates. These chemicals are left over, and you can use them to pre-wet the other chemicals that we're already using. And by pre-wetting them, they make them sticky and they stay where you put them, which is a good thing. We like that. But remember, the carbohydrate enhanced product doesn't actually melt anything. Okay? It doesn't actually melt anything. So it's part of the equation. Putting straight, it wouldn't do you that much good. How many of you have used these? If you would raise your hand. Let me lower all the hands first. The hands are down. Now raise your hand if you've used these carbohydrate enhanced materials. And by the way, you can buy them at the local Agway or home supply place for your own sidewalks. But just like anything, you want to use as much as you need, but not anymore. So just a couple of you. Again, I think these things have their place, just like any tool in a toolkit. And you may want to look at it because one of the things we're trying to do is make the chemicals sticky. Because the chemical form actually matters. You can put down a solid chemical, but the problem with a solid chemical is it scatters, and I'll show you that in just a second. Liquid chemicals, which are used either straight liquids in certain events or even what they call anti-icing, that's what this truck is doing. We spray a liquid. The nice thing about a liquid is even when you spray it in these little bands, it sort of levels out, and then it keeps any bonds of ice from forming, and the plow can come along and push the snow and any ice that starts to form off to the side. It doesn't bond. We like that. And it stays where you put it, pretty much, unless you put too much, again. Pre-wetting the chemicals isn't the same as liquids, but it has the advantage it can stay in a pile. You don't have to have tanks, and liquids in certain conditions can actually create a slippery condition that we don't want. So it's nice to have the pre-wetting as one of the options available. And pre-wetting is something that can work. You could theoretically pre-wet with just plain water if you could keep it warm enough where it didn't freeze. Obviously, that's a challenge. That's when we usually use some chemicals to do this, a salt-based product or one of these enhanced products. But here's what I mentioned about the dry salt. This is a study done out of Michigan. And what they did is they spread 100% of the salt that they would need down the center, and then they waited for traffic to come along. And what they found was that about half the salt stayed in the center, but half the salt, about a quarter of it, went off each side. In fact, 15% went off to the shoulder and doesn't do any good at all. All it's going to do is damage the plants and actually bring deer to the road. It's not going to really do what you want to do. They pre-wetted the salt. This isn't anything other than simple pre-wetting. Same 100%. Almost 80% of it stayed where they put it. 9% scattered off, and only 2% went off to the side into the shoulder and into the ditches. So it really makes a big difference if you pre-wet your salt. And that's why we're a big fan of pre-wetting and being part of your plan, part of your overall approach. Okay? So again, think about what chemicals you're using and try to come up with the right ones, how you put them down, how you treat them, and you probably are going to have sand in your system somewhere. But how you use that depends on where you are and, of course, what kind of events and weather events you have to deal with. And we do need to think about the environmental issues. It really does make a difference, okay? And we don't want to put down too much salt. We need enough to do the job, but not too much. So what I've got here is two piles, okay, of salt in one case and sand with only 10% salt. As I mentioned earlier, you only want to put down enough salt to keep the sand from freezing. And that's about 10, 15%. You don't need any more than that. Heck, you could probably get away with 5% if you could mix it thoroughly. Okay, so now these piles are sitting outside. And they're 50 feet in diameter, and along comes a storm like we got yesterday. We got 1 inch of rain over our watershed that serves the city of Ithaca yesterday. That means we can take showers this week. Yay, we needed the rain. I get 1 inch of rain on my big pile of salt, 50 feet in diameter, and I collect all of the water that runs off. And then I figure out how much salt is in them. Okay? So, I'm going to lower your hands again. I'm going to ask you 3 questions. How many of you think that there's more salt in the water that comes off the salt pile? Raise your hand if you think more water runs off the salt pile. Okay, I got 1, 2, 3, 4. I'll give you another 10 seconds. Okay, so about 9 of you. Okay, I'm going to lower your hands. How many of you think more comes off the sand with a little bit of salt in it pile? Okay, we got it 7, so we're up to 16 people. Oh, we got 9, so about equal, about 50-50. Now I'm going to lower your hands one last time. How many of you think that the 2 piles have the same amount of salt runoff? Okay, so 9 of you voted for salt being worse, 9 of you voted for the sand salt mixture being worse, and only 3 of you voted for them being the same. And of course, a lot of you didn't vote. That's the American way, I guess. The answer is they're pretty much equal. The water that comes off is pretty much saturated at some point, and the reality is you're going to get about the same amount of salt. So in terms of an open pile, you really want to think about covering your piles up. If they're open, you're going to get salt runoff. You've all seen that as you've driven around. You're going to get almost the same amount. Technically, slightly more salt in the straight salt pile at only 10%. But if you had a 25% pile, you would actually get saturated conditions and it'd be exactly the same. So think about covering your piles. And again, only put as much salt as you need to keep the sand from freezing. If you can keep it indoors, you can get away with less salt. So maybe something to think about. So let's see what you guys have in your plans, or after our time together so far, what have you thought about you would like to have in your policy? Okay, so you can pick, are you going to have salt? Are you going to have abrasives mixed with salt? Are you going to have treated salt? Are you thinking about liquids, anti-icing? Or is there something else you're thinking about that we just didn't talk about? And if you do put other, please put that in the Q&A. Let's see what you guys come up with. Okay. Okay, so of those who voted, 8 have voted for treated salt, 8 have voted for going to having some abrasives. Some of you are thinking about liquids. That's good. Anti-icing. Anti-icing is really something we all should be thinking about. And again, we talk a lot more about that in the workshop. And the reason anti-icing should probably be in our bag of tricks is because it's a lot less energy to keep the bond from forming, which means a lot less energy to plow it off than to wait till the bond forms and try to scrape it away. Think about your own driveway. If you can get out there and shovel when it's only an inch or two, it's a lot easier to get the snow off than to wait till it's built up and there's a bond and now you have to break up the ice. That's really what anti-icing is trying to do. We're trying to keep that bond from forming. Obviously, we can't deal with an ice storm as perfectly, but we can do something with snow if we've got a good plan in place. Okay. So again, you're going to be thinking about your chemical and abrasives policy, and you're probably going to have a mix. Okay. So let's go back to our snow and ice plan. Okay. Let's see what you guys come up with. And again, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to let you put in your answers. Give me what you would have. What are the parts of your snow and ice plan? Let's see what y'all come up with. And again, I'll show you the answers here in about 30 seconds. I'm going to give you 30 seconds. What do you think needs to be part of a good snow and ice plan? course, some of you may have downloaded our plan from our website and you already know the answer and you're just typing them in. That's fine. Just put in the parts of a snow and ice control plan. Okay, let's see what y'all come up with. You need to have your priorities. What roads are first? Okay, so maybe you're going to put that on a map. That's a good way to do it. Your level of service, and that level of service may be different for different types of roadways. Okay, what are the routes? You probably need to think about your routes, which means you're going to have to update that plan possibly every single year, and maybe even have a backup plan if a piece of equipment breaks down. What treatments are you going to use for different storms and application rates? And yes, these are things that you could set up. You can actually set up a single piece of paper that could fit in the truck. So a driver might know, hey, we've got heavy snow, we're going to do this level of application. We've got light snow or ice, we're going to do this. We're going to turn the liquids off in certain situations near freezing because we don't want to create a slick spot. Okay, so good. These are all the things to think about. Obviously, you're going to have what type of hours do you have? Do you work 24/7 or do you do shifts? Do you work at night? What equipment do you have? What are your backup plans? What's the terrain? What are the emergency routes? And you probably need to be thinking about public involvement, how you're going to communicate with the public on these things. When are you going to tell them? Maybe you remind them in the fall. And you may think about getting outside help. Somebody put in the Q&A. Good response. What is our shared services that we might have? And you might even have a contract with another agency. So these are all things that have to be part of a good snow and ice control plan. Okay, very good. Nice job. Now, let's talk a little bit about equipment. Equipment has gotten a little bit better since the days of plowing it with animals. But surprisingly, it's still the same concept. We still want people to get from point A to point B, and we want them to do so in a safe manner. So how many trucks do you have in your fleet? Okay. Is that less than 5, more than 25? I'm just trying to get a sense of how big your agencies are. Okay. Okay, so a lot of you actually have pretty large fleets, 10 to or more. Okay. You're probably in pretty good shape. You may even have a spare or two that you might be able to keep off, not part of your route, so if something breaks down. You may want, if you're in one of the smaller ones, in the less than 5 or the 5 to 10, you may not have a spare. So you may want to find your bigger neighbors and find out, do they have a spare if one of yours breaks down? How do you do a shared services? What are your options if something breaks down? And we always start with the trucks, but we also know that our fleet, if we really look at it carefully, includes a lot more than just trucks. And even the type of truck can make a difference. Is it a 6-wheeler? Is it a 10-wheeler? Is it a pickup plow? Is it just a 1-ton that's got a small sander or a water tank on the back for salt run? What attachments do you have? Do you have plows? What kind of applicators do you have on the back? Is there feedback to the operator? That can make a huge difference in terms of giving them pavement temperature, giving them air temperature. By the way, if I'm given a choice, I'd rather have pavement temperature. That's actually more useful. But again, what feedback do we have? And do you have good two-way radios? And if you're in a rural area, are there places where the two-way radio doesn't work or your cell doesn't work? When I walk into work, if I want to call somebody while I'm walking into work, there's actually a spot up on top of the hill where it doesn't work. And I think I finally figured out why. There's actually some wires as part of a fence, and they act as an interference pattern. And my self-service disappears. You probably have spots in your community where driving along, no service, no radio service, no cell service. So something to think about as part of your system. Do you have wings? Do you have shoes? Do you have special blades of different types? Live edge plows, stuff like that. Let's just see over on raising your hand. Let me lower the hands again. I'm making you raise your hands a lot today. If you run with shoes on your plow or wing, raise your hand. If you run with shoes. And by the way, somebody mentioned for the fleet having a good pavement preventive maintenance. Preventive maintenance or PM plan. I agree. You really want a good plan to maintain your equipment in good shape because we're going to abuse the heck out of it this winter. That happens every winter. So just a few of you are running with shoes. Shoes have their place and they do protect the blade from damage, but you have to do that carefully and you need different types of shoes. There are rubber shoes, there's hardened materials, there's even metal shoes. You can see this live edge plow in the lower left corner. There's actually a plow shoe running behind it to set the overall height, but the blade itself actually goes up and down like a new style razor. Every foot can go in a different direction, up and down. It's pretty cool. So again, what do you have? When do you use it? A good example is your wings. A lot of agencies in their policy don't plow the shoulder until the ground is completely frozen. I would not, by the way, do that based on date. Don't say you can start plowing after December 8th or something, because you and I both know some winters are colder than others. If you want that policy, and I don't disagree with it in the slightest, you may want to think about running the plows after you know it's frozen, or maybe you're even running shoes that keep it up off the ground, some wider shoes for shoulder work, so you don't damage your shoulder. Okay, something to keep in mind. Do you have spreaders? And spreaders, of course, can be spreading solid materials. Spreaders can be doing liquid materials. Okay, could spread in front of the drive wheel. You could spread behind the drive wheel. Okay, you can push it off to one side or the other. I'll tell you right now, there are people who love the spreader that's just in front of the drive wheel. There are people who hate it with a passion. My advice, if you're thinking about doing something else, ask around, find somebody who's got one and try it out, look at it, see what it does. You know, each has its place. Obviously, if you're spreading in front of the drive wheel, that's good, but your steering wheels are still in front of your spreading material and can be hard to maintain. Putting it in the back, you might have to go backwards in some cases, which can be okay going uphill or in a slow speed, but in an urban area or down a steep slope, that might not be something you really want to do very often. And of course, tanks, small tank, big tank, what's the size of the cycle length? How far can you go? All things that have to be thought of to set up your plan. And of course, rate control. This is done mostly electronically. It's preset more and more. We're getting computer controls in these things. And this is something you want to think about, maybe upgrading your system. If you can get it where the operator can not have to do as much fiddling around, that's better off for everybody, especially if you're using a one-person plow, which, again, most agencies do these days. Not all, but most. And there's a variety of reasons why people don't do more than one person. Feedback, again, could be in the form of temperatures. Pavement is my preferred temperature, but both is even nicer. You could have a camera, both for backup purposes and to see if there's material properly coming out the back. If you just notice that, wait a second, there's nothing coming out the back, that can be very useful. Make sure you protect those cameras. You put them in something that will keep them from getting damaged by falling debris, snow, ice, wind, and you may have to clean them off on a regular basis if it's a camera or even a temperature device. So keep that in mind. Any other new equipment that y'all have been using? And this one, I'll just go ahead and, yeah, response is already turned on. What other new equipment are you using or have you seen that you want to share with us and share with others? What other new equipment ideas are out there? No new ideas? Hmm. Hoping to pick up a couple things. Oh, smaller trucks with a jag wing. Okay, so a small wing on the side, sometimes on both sides. Okay. And for an urban area, that can actually be very useful. Of course, that reduces the amount of chemical or sand that you can carry, so you're going to have to set your routes up around it, but it might be easier to get in and out of a residential area or tight spots or narrow road. Yeah. Again, we want to share ideas. Try something out. Look and see what's out there. There's the new live edge plows. There's of course the problem we've got of the supply chain. That's hard to get the larger trucks. So again, when we order a truck, we need to be thinking out 18 to 24 months before the new thing here. And then somebody put into the Q&A that their two trucks are over 40 years old. is that worth maintaining those, or how do we get new ones? Because at some point the equipment will break down no matter how well we treat it. So something we have to think about. And yes, some people like double wings. They'll pick the wing up and go around the cul-de-sac the opposite direction, and they'll just use the inside wing. So again, think about this. You got to be thinking out into the future, 2, 3, 4 years, because of both planning for what's coming this year, but also planning for what equipment you're going to get and what we're going to have for our operational plans as we go into the future. Now, in terms of your application rates, which one of these affects your application rate? You can mark all of these. Do you just use a standard application rate all the time? Do you change based on participation type and intensity, your route length, air temperature, pavement temperature, traffic and time of day, and of course, looking at the weather? Which one of these affects? And again, you can mark all of these. And for reasons that makes perfect sense, they give me a total percentage, but it's okay. I can just look at things. Okay. So most of you look at participation type and intensity, and that absolutely needs to be part of your equation. Having a standard rate as a starting point is not bad, but be careful that you don't just stick with that in every single situation, because there will be times when you need to put more or less, and you want to do that in a controlled way. It's more efficient and you'll save money. Okay. Route length, actually, we should definitely include route length, because route length means a longer cycle time. And I could have said cycle time and said a very similar thing. And the idea is, if you've got a long cycle time, you've got more chance for more snow to come down or ice. And now you may have to break that up with not anti-icing, but de-icing. It takes more chemical. So something to think about. Air temperature makes a difference, but pavement temperature does more. So that's good. I like to see that. And don't ask me how we get 900%. I didn't do that math. Traffic and time of day. Yeah, that can make a difference. We know that certain times of day there may be more traffic that will help us if it's moving, but it could hurt us if it stopped. And of course, we should be looking at the weather forecast. We can get a weather forecast from a company or we can go online, but we got to be looking down the road, probably at least the length of a cycle, and probably two if we can. In terms of your routes, you're going to be setting the length. Are you an OPP, one person plowing operation, or you have multiple people? What time of day do you have shift works? You're going to have to obviously do more application on curves or hills, or if you're in an area with a lot of trees and it's tight, these are all things that are going to change what you have to do. At intersections, you're going to have to treat things differently. You got a bigger surface, it may be hard to plow them. And of course, if you have shade due to buildings even, that can make a difference. Do you have drifting? Do you have snow fence because of drifting? Or you can change the slope of the ground so that it doesn't tend to drop the snow right in your roadway and you have to plow through it. And do you have and or allow traffic and parking? And now if you're in a rural area, you probably don't have to think about this too much, but you might be surprised. Pedestrians and bicycles. Do you have a different thing you do for sidewalks? Do you have to deal with the fact that there might be bicycles on the road even in the winter? Certainly something here at Cornell. They have to worry about bicyclists. There are people who will bicycle even during a snowstorm. So again, that needs to all be part of your overall plan. And in terms of your spread rates and the patterns that you're using, weather and cycle time are going to make a difference. Pavement temperature is by far the most important, and the pavement quality can make a difference as well. If you've got a pavement that's nice and smooth and well maintained, it's going to take less chemical, less sand even, to treat that road and be able to get it back to where you want it. And the traffic can help you as well. And what materials do you use? Okay, so now let's go back in here. And this time I'm going to clear everything once it goes here. What factors have changed your application rate? Let's see which ones you put down now. Yeah, you can check just about every single one of them. Again, I'm okay with people having a starting application rate. That's a good place to start, but don't just stick to it. Please think about alternatives. We're already doing it. We probably should do it in a more formalized way, mainly to be efficient and to communicate with the public. And of course, I do want to end a little bit with a couple of things that are part of the challenge. And one of them is emergencies. Ice storms, they're so much fun. How many of you have been through an ice storm? Raise your hand if you've been through an ice storm. If you don't raise your hand, by the way, you probably will. We are going to see more ice storms into the future. They can be lots of fun. Uh, in my life, I've been through two, more than a week, everything was shut down ice storms. They are not fun when the trees come down. Are you ready for it? Do you have backup plans and generators? You will be called upon if you work for a public works department because you're a first responder. Okay? And of course, we can have localized emergencies such as a crash that can occur. And you're the person called out to salt to provide a little bit of traction. Maybe just throw some sand down. Help out with a crash that occurs. And of course, when those major storms occur, if we know about them in advance, we may want to pre-stage. We may want to change when the crews are in. And so these are all things you need to be thinking about. It's the kind of thing you hope it never happens, but you should plan for it. And do you have specialized equipment for dealing with odd situations? Like some agencies actually put V-plows or plow blades on their graders, or snow goes, essentially supersized snow blowers that throw the snow and any mailboxes they come across into the air over to the side. Great for going through banks, something you may only use once every decade, but you got to make sure they're actually working and in good condition. They certainly need to be fired up every year and checked out. Do you share with each other? Do you have a place where, for instance, in this case, we have a county and the state sharing where they get their salt and to get their sand? Do you have shared services? Do you have an agreement? Do you have a backup plan? All part of the equation that we have to think about. So in your overall snow and ice control plan, you can only do so much. Don't think you can handle everything and you can get certain major events. On the other hand, this is in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin. Every year, this can happen. They have to be ready for it. And by the way, if you're at the end of Onondaga Lake, you're probably going to be dealing with ice flows jamming up every winter. Where does this fit in your snow and ice policy, in your snow and ice plan? Why is a written policy recommended, by the way? Why is a written policy recommended? Liability. I hate to have to put that first, but you're right. Liability is definitely one of the reasons, yeah. Knowledge transfer. Yeah, clear direction, communication, both internally with your own people, the board, and the public. And everybody's on the same page so that when they go, where's the plow? Well, we had to make a choice. And we had to not be out there in the middle of the night because of economics, because of the budget. Okay? And everybody knows, just don't hit the blast button the whole way. Somebody might ask for it. And it's a good communication tool. It can actually help you if you're one of the elected town folks to get your election. And it really helps figure out your priorities and it's a good communication and consistency. Very good answers, okay? A written policy can make a huge difference. Now, I'm going to tell you something. Make it shorter than you think. Don't make it super, super complicated. Think carefully. If it's not needed, don't put it in there. Because remember, the one danger is once you put it in writing, it's something you have to follow or you actually increase your liability. Okay? So define things, define them clearly, but don't make it super, super complicated that nobody reads it, just sits on a shelf. I'd much rather have a plan you follow that's simple. The KISS system does work. Okay? So we're going to end with a few questions. Okay? So what is the least important in determining a chemical application rate? If I could only pick three of these, which is least important? Yeah, air temperature. That's the one we can measure. And so if you don't have pavement temperature, it is a surrogate for it. But remember, the pavement temperature can be very different. And of course, if you get a situation where the air temperature is above freezing and the pavement temperature is below freezing, and there's moisture available through snow or worse yet, rain, you can get ice forming. And black ice, that can form in that situation can be really slippery, really dangerous. You can even get what's called freezing fog in certain situations. So yeah, I'd really like having that pavement temperature, but again, the more of these you know, the better off you're going to be. So what is, of these four choices, what is the shortest distance for stopping distance? Now, obviously, dry is the shortest, but what's the shortest stopping distance? In other words, I hit the brakes. Am I going to stop fastest on ice? Am I going to stop fastest on clear pack, slushy road with no bonded ice, or soft snow, loose snow? Okay? It's not ice. I'll give you a hint. And if you put none of the above, then you need to tell me what, other than dry, what's the shortest? It's actually B, a slushy road where the vehicle can actually get to the pavement. If there's no bonded ice, you can still stop pretty close. It's little more than a wet road, about 15, 20% more. But as long as you can get your pavement and your tires contacting each other, you're going to stop a little faster. Soft, loose snow that's over the whole road, you're going to tend to not stop quite as fast. Same with snowpack, and of course, ice can be very slippery. A bare road policy is always recommended for high volume roads. What do you think? Yeah. Uh, People think we should have a bare road policy. It's almost impossible to have one. We need to think about when we want to get back to having quote unquote bare roads. But what bare road policies did to us is they made us think we could always get to that. They actually created some environmental issues for us. And they actually led to lawsuits because you didn't meet your policy, now you're actually exposing yourself to liability. So think carefully about what level of service. When do you get the road back to being mostly bare? Okay. And I like the word mostly bare or clear for traffic or something like that than completely black. That's can be difficult to get to it. Okay. So we're going to end with a couple of things. I told you I would tell you about our fall workshops, specifically snow and ice. Okay. We still have some slots. Okay. In Otsego, Hamilton, and Jefferson County. That's next week. If you're nearby, you get 6 hours of some really good information, a lot more details, and you can have your questions answered by the instructor and by the other people who are in attendance. And those are definitely being run. We've got 3 that are going to be in the western part of the state, Onondaga, Schuyler, and Allegheny in October. We'd love to see you there. Same thing. We need to make sure we have numbers to share information. Now, I thank you for coming to the webinars this summer and winter. We're getting ready for our next series because our budget year starts with the LTAP Center the 1st of October. So these are our foundational webinars. We repeat some of them. The ones in the left column are ones we've done this year. We'll repeat them again. So you'll hear more about the snow and ice overview again about a year from now. But we're also doing some we haven't done in a couple of years on bridge basics, erosion, guide rail, pavement materials, things like that. And we're planning on a few additional webinars on local road safety plans and the associated activities that go with it, such as proving countermeasures and roadway curvatures. So watch this space. Look for our emails. If you are not on our mailing list, make sure you get onto it. And the easiest way to do that is go on our website or send us an email. And with that, I'll give you a couple of minutes back of your day. Hopefully it's the winner you want. And again, I'm not going to say if that's light or heavy because everybody has different opinions on that. And with that, thank you for joining us in the webinars this summer. And we'll see you at workshops this fall, at conferences coming up, and hopefully webinars in the winter. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.